Raiders suddenly appear off England's east coast, landing on Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island. There they massacre monks, steal treasures and holy relics, then disappear back into the dark sea. This marked Western Europe's first brutal encounter with the Vikings. For 3 centuries, these pagan pirates from Scandinavia struck fear across Europe, raiding, extorting, enslaving and eventually conquering. Their raids reached deep into Russia and the Mediterranean, even attacking what they called Miklagard, or the great city Constantinople. Equipped with longships and unmatched skills in seamanship and navigation, the Vikings could strike unexpectedly and with precision. But their adversaries, including the Anglo-Saxons and Franks, were also part of proud warrior cultures. Was there something deeper behind the Vikings' deadly effectiveness? Professor Tom Shippey, a specialist in Viking history and medieval literature, believes their success is partially due to a unique mentality. This mindset is revealed in the Vikings' own sagas, many of which were written in Old Norse, their language. Among these sagas are the well-known sagas of Icelanders as well as the Konunga Sögur, or sagas of kings, and the Fornaldar Sögur, or sagas of old times. Though these texts are sometimes viewed skeptically due to being written centuries later in distant Iceland, many dismiss them as purely fictional. While much of the content is indeed fictional or fairy tale-like, there are elements that can be identified as more than mere storytelling. Much of the sagas aren't entirely fictional. I believe they're rooted in family traditions and memories preserved by people who couldn't read or write, but had remarkable recall. They took their memories seriously and passed them down. Regardless of whether you regard them as fact or fiction, these sagas consistently reflect a mindset I describe as the Viking mindset. This mindset is notably distinctive. 2 key aspects stand out: a deep fascination with death, particularly famous death songs and heroic last stands, and a characteristic sense of humour, though it's not what most would call good humour. Rather, it's often dark and cruel. This dark humour is evident throughout their stories. For example, in the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, a legendary Viking warrior who was the son of a Swedish king and even fought a dragon. After seeking further fame and fortune in England, he was shipwrecked off Northumbria's coast and captured by its Christian king, Ella, who condemned him to a grisly death in a pit of venomous snakes. As Ragnar faced his doom, he mocked the king with the famous line, "Gnidja mundu grisir ef galtar hag visi." It translates to something like, "The piggies would grunt if they knew how the old boar died." This remark was both a joke and a threat, a crude pun on pigs and boars, signalling that Ragnar's sons would avenge him in a way that would leave King Ella trembling. It's a threat. Interestingly, even though this story comes from a later saga, the tale of the piggies was already known earlier. A Latin chronicler quoted the phrase, but he misunderstood its meaning. He thought Ragnar was saying, "If my sons knew about this, they'd come to save me." However, Ragnar wasn't hoping for rescue. He knew he had no chance of escaping. He was actually declaring that once his sons heard of his death, they would seek vengeance. And of course, they did. Ragnar's death in the snake pit is almost certainly fictional, but his sons, the piggies, were very real. In 865, they landed in England with a great army, ravaging East Anglia and Northumbria and killing King Ella. Is there any connection between the historical events and the saga of Ragnar's death? The men who invaded England were identified early on as the Ragnarsons. My theory is that the story of Ragnar's death in the snake pit was created later to explain and motivate the invasion of England. The Ragnarsons came to avenge their father's death. By fabricating a tale of how he died, it made their vengeance seem even more justified. Why did the Ragnarsons invade England? It was to avenge their father. So, a story was invented about his death, designed to explain why they sought vengeance. The legend of Hrolf, a great Danish king of the 6th century, often compared to King Arthur, also comes from a similar period. Hrolf's great hall stood near Ledra, where he hosted a famous band of champions. However, his throne was coveted by many, including his cousin Jorvard, who launched a surprise dawn attack on Hrolf's hall. After a fierce last stand, Hrolf died, surrounded by his champions. The only survivor was Voga, the weakest of Hrolf's warriors, who had been the subject of many jokes, even as he swore to avenge his king. Voga was brought before the new king, Jorvard. With Hrolf and all his champions dead, the right thing to do would have been to dispose of Voga. Instead, Jorvard thought it would be wise to force the last surviving champion to swear allegiance to him. So, they made Voga swear his loyalty on Jorvard's sword. Bad move. Voga picked up the sword and killed Jorvard, ending both his life and the Silding dynasty. Voga was immediately killed in turn, but he had fulfilled his vow. This is another example of the Viking knack for dark wit. Ragnar's joke was on King Ella and Voga's was on King Jorvard. It's darkly amusing in a twisted way. Legends of King Hrolf come from the so-called Dark Ages, a tumultuous period in European history. However, recent archaeological discoveries suggest these tales may have a factual basis. King Hrolf, like King Arthur, was once considered purely mythological. But after a chance find, archaeologists began investigating the site of Hrolf's court in Ledra, Denmark, which was long thought to be fictional. To their surprise, they uncovered a series of enormous halls, at least 6 of them, spanning the Viking and pre-Viking eras. So at least part of the story is true. Ledra, once known as Ledraborg, was indeed a major centre of power during the early Viking period. The Jomsvikings were another legendary group of Viking mercenaries, known for their strict code of honour. According to Old Norse sagas, they were based at Jomsborg on the Baltic coast. In 986, they were hired by the King of Denmark to help defeat Jarl Håkon of Lad. However, at the Battle of Hjörungavágr, the Jomsvikings suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Jarl Håkon and his son Jarl Eirik. Vikings were notorious for showing no mercy or expecting any in return. After the battle, the Jomsviking prisoners were lined up for execution. The beheadings began, but the Jomsvikings, bound by their code which forbade them from showing fear, stood firm. One of them even insisted on being beheaded while standing rather than kneeling, so that everyone could see he did not flinch from the blow. One man did kneel to be beheaded and, worried about his hair, asked someone to pull it over his head to avoid blood splatter. But as the axe swung, he jerked his head back, causing the axe to strike off the hands of the person holding his hair. Now that's a dark sense of humour. The moment was so unexpected and comical that everyone burst out laughing, especially Jarl Eirik, who found it the funniest thing he had ever seen. "That was such a great joke," he said. "All right, we'll let you go." The Jomsviking, however, insisted, "I can't accept that unless you spare all the others too." And so the rest of the Jomsvikings were set free. Of course, this is pure fiction. Well, at least that's what I thought. But recently, about 15 miles from where we're standing, road construction uncovered a mass grave of about 50 skeletons, along with a separate pile of skulls. All of the skeletons had been decapitated. Upon examination, it was revealed that they were all male, mostly young and of Scandinavian descent. It seemed there had indeed been a mass beheading, just as described in the saga. And some of the men had been beheaded from the front, just as in the story. Once again, what appeared to be pure fiction turns out to have some historical truth behind it. Olaf Haraldsson, who would later become King of Norway and its patron saint, was once a feared Viking before converting to Christianity. In 1029, he was exiled by the Danes and local jarls. When he returned the next year to reclaim his throne, he faced a massive army of hostile pagan farmers. Retreat was not an option for Olaf. On the morning of the battle, he woke up early and asked his poet Thormod to sing to him to pass the time before the battle began. Thormod began singing the Bjarkamal, a poem originally attributed to Bodvar Bjarka, which was meant to be sung on the day of the final stand of King Hrolf, whom we've discussed earlier. The poem began, "The day has come up, the roosters clap their wings, time for the wretched serfs to do the heavy labour. Wake now, wake, all you best men of Adil's people, Har the hard grip, Hrolf the shooter, men of good birth who do not flee. I do not wake you for wine or women's whispers, I wake you for the hard sport of Hilda." It seems like an odd choice for a morale-boosting song, considering it's a suicide poem predicting certain death, but the Vikings embraced it. "Great song," they said, "just the thing to fire us up for battle." Though the odds were against them, Olaf and his men pressed on. Thormod's song, which predicted their doomed fate, proved eerily prophetic. Olaf was killed in battle, struck down by multiple spear and axe blows, and as expected, his bodyguard was slain around him. But Thormod the poet survived. It wasn't by any merit of his own, he simply happened to be one of the few who didn't die. After the battle ended, Thormod mourned that he had not been able to join his king in death. Just then, an arrow flew out of nowhere and struck him. The implication was clear. It was sent by the deceased king to fulfill Thormod's wish to join him. Thormod, in his final moments, began composing a poem about his own death, but he never finished it. He died on his feet, still reciting the lines, but never completing the last one. Luckily, a bystander completed the final line for him. That bystander was none other than the teenage Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and one of the most legendary Vikings. Harald's adventures took him to the city of Kiev, where he served at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, and later to Constantinople, where he commanded the Varangian Guard under the Byzantine Emperor. As King of Norway, Harald Hardrada was known for his bravery, cruelty and ambition. In 1066, he set his sights on claiming the English throne, but King Harold Godwinson moved quickly to face him. The Vikings were caught by surprise at Stamford Bridge because they were unprepared for the sudden arrival of the English army. Harold Godwinson's forces advanced rapidly through York, and the Norwegians only realized the English were approaching when they saw the glint of weapons. Harold Godwinson's forces advanced rapidly through York, and the Norwegians only realized the English were approaching when they saw the glint of weapons. On that hot day, the Vikings had left their heavy armor and shields on their ships, leaving them vulnerable. On that hot day, the Vikings had left their heavy armor and shields on their ships, leaving them vulnerable. Hardrada, undeterred, led his men into battle without his armor. Hardrada, undeterred, led his men into battle without his armor. According to the Heimskringla sagas by Snorri Sturluson, even in this moment, Hardrada composed poetry. Forward we go in formation, without armor against blue steel edges. Helmets shine. I don't have mine, now our gear lies down with the ships. It's a decent poem, but Hardrada, ever the poetic snob, decided it was too simple and composed a more complex one, declaring, "That's much better." Hardrada charged into the fray, sword in hand, fighting fiercely and unprotected. Hardrada charged into the fray, sword in hand, fighting fiercely and unprotected. Fearless to the end, he was ultimately struck down by an English arrow to the throat, and most of his army perished with him. He is often remembered as the last Viking. According to the saga, the Norwegians arrived with 400 ships, but only 24 survived to return home. The Anglo-Saxons allowed them to leave, signalling the end of the Norse dream of conquering England. With Hardrada's death, the Viking era effectively ended. He died like a Viking, making jokes, writing poems and fighting to the last. But can we truly attribute these poems to Harald Hardrada? Given that few Norwegians survived to recount the events, it seems unlikely these poems are genuine. I suspect Snorri Sturluson crafted them to enrich his story. Nevertheless, they capture a certain spirit, one of resignation but also defiance. We won't win this time, they've caught us, but that's life. We'll fight to the end. This embodies the Viking attitude, never entirely defeated. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge had unintended consequences. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge had unintended consequences. It paved the way for another invader to seize the English throne. While the battle was a disastrous defeat for the Norwegians, it also took a heavy toll on the English, leaving them weakened. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson's army faced William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson's army faced William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. Had they been at full strength, it's likely they would have won. On October 14th, 1066, the English army was decisively defeated and Harold Godwinson was killed. England's new ruler, William the Conqueror, was himself descended from a Viking adventurer, marking the end of the Viking Age. England's new ruler, William the Conqueror, was himself descended from a Viking adventurer, marking the end of the Viking Age. For nearly 3 centuries, Scandinavian warriors had terrorized Europe, their fearlessness in the face of death giving them a lethal edge. What stands out about the Viking mindset isn't just their defiance in battle, though that's what heroes are supposed to do. What stands out about the Viking mindset isn't just their defiance in battle, though that's what heroes are supposed to do. It's their matter-of-fact approach to death, combined with a certain humor. Whether it's Ragnar joking from the snake pit, Vogr playing a trick with his allegiance, the Jomsvikings' crude humor, or Hardrada's poetic pretensions, all of them show an awareness that death is inevitable. But rather than fear it, they seem determined to make it memorable. For me, the Viking attitude is clear. You can kill them. Believe me, we did, but you won't scare them. For me, the Viking attitude is clear. You can kill them. Believe me, we did, but you won't scare them. They'll always come back.